Hello everyone, welcome back to our videos, life-changing tuition videos on comprehension. It is still me. I've just had a haircut. Still the same teacher. Uh, could be wiser. Maybe I'm less wise. Maybe the English know-how was stored in the hair. We'll find out. We're doing these videos to keep instilling the same principles of how to solve comprehension. Please watch back through the other ones, but we're trying to encourage attentive reading. Reading and not being distracted, looking out there at the same time. Actually, processing everything that's in that comprehension. You shouldn't need to come to an answer and guess. You should never guess. You should already have a good indication, or you should, at the very least, after a first read, be able to place where you'll need to look for things. So, like laying down a map. You should be able to go through a comprehension and go, oh, okay, well, that paragraph's that paragraph's that. As you read, make sure you know the geography of the piece, right? What is in this section, what is in that section. We should never be guessing just because there is a word that we recognise from the comprehension in one of the answers. It must be the correct answer. That's not always the case. Make sure you read the question properly, understand it. Sometimes you get questions with multiple correct answers. You just need to know what the best correct answer is. Any other principles? Yes, when you're reading the comprehension, forget all logic from the outside world. All your answers are in the comprehension. Just because, say, if it's a comprehension on, I don't know, football, and it's like, who's the best team in the world, and Manchester City most recently won the Premier League, and you go, oh, Man City are the best team in the world, and they're an option, so that must be true. No. Look in the comprehension. It's asking you what the comprehension thinks is the best football team in the world, right? So, with that being said, please, if you want a further exploration of those tips and tricks, look in the previous videos. Let's have a look at this one. This is an excerpt, a bit of writing from a book, an excerpt from a book by one of my favourite authors, Charles Dickens, very famous book, Oliver Twist. I'll stop along the way, we'll define some words together, I'll underline them as we've done before. I could highlight them actually, that might be more sensible. We'll define the words, we'll talk about some things as we go. Let's just get right into it, let's have a read. So, Oliver Twist, Comprehension 6 today. Among other public buildings in a certain town, which for many reasons it will be prudent. For something to be prudent, write this down as I explain this to you. Remember, it's always a very good idea to keep some sort of record of vocabulary you've learned, because then you'll recognise it the next time it comes up because you've learned it, and also you can start to use it in your own writing to not just to pick up marks in creative writing, but to sound more intelligent in your own right, to get your points across more succinctly, more successfully. You'll be able to say exactly what you mean instead of having to use words that just don't do as well. So for something to be prudent is for it to be wise. It's prudent of you to do that. It's wise. It's probably a good option. Among other public buildings in a certain town, which for many reasons it will be prudent to refrain from mentioning, and to which I will give no fictitious. Now, it's a trick I keep coming back to. Find the similar sounds that you've seen in other words that you know the definition of. Fictitious, fiction. If something's fictitious, it is fiction, it's fake. I will give no fake name to it. He's not going to tell you the town, he's not going to give it a fake name, it's just not important. Among other public buildings in a certain town, which for many reasons it will be prudent to refrain from mentioning, and to which I will assign no... he's talking about the other public buildings. He's saying that among other public buildings, it will be wise not to name, all of them, because that would take too long, and to which I will assign no fake name, because, what's the point? There was one anciently very old, we know that one, common to most towns, great or small, to wit. To wit is another sort of turn of phrase. It's something we say, a turn of phrase. A turn of phrase. It's just these little idioms and phrases we throw into our writing. To wit is one of them. It's a similar turn of phrase to, for example. to wit, a workhouse. For example, where did I write it down? Did I write it down? Oh, it's up there. Sorry. It's another way of saying, yeah. For example, is it's thought. We know the word wit as well. It's intelligence. It's thought. Wit, quick intelligence. A workhouse. And in this workhouse was born on a day and date which I need not trouble myself to repeat, inasmuch as it can be of no possible consequence to the reader. In this stage of the business, at all events, the item of mortality whose name is prefixed to the head of this chapter. Now, let's talk about translating writing from other times. Dickens, brilliant writer, is from the 1800s, Victorian. We're talking about Victorian literature. Now, a brilliant time for English literature. You've got Charles Dickens, you've got Frankenstein, you've got great poetry, amazing writing coming out of Victorian England. Dickens is my favourite. He has a very particular kind of writing, which is not like a lot of writing we see nowadays. He uses incredibly long sentences, for instance. Let's just study this here. Among other buildings in a certain town, comma, keep going, comma, keep going, comma, keep going, colon, comma, semicolon, semicolon, comma, comma, semicolon. Finally a full stop. In that whole paragraph, there's a lot of punctuation. There is one sentence. That whole paragraph is one sentence. He hasn't done anything grammatically wrong. It might be not advisable. We might not recommend it because it's a very long sentence. But the thing about Dickens is he was an incredibly skilled writer and storyteller, so he can get away with it. And it's his own style. But we need to understand that that's the way he writes. We need to be okay reading that. We need to become accustomed to it. We need to be familiar enough for it to not scare us, for it to not put us off. And we need to be able to, despite all these long, winding sentences, we need to be able to break them down and to actually figure out what's being said in them. We can't just go, that's a long sentence, I don't know, I'm going to panic. We need to know. So, when we look, for instance, we talk about translating and the way things are written. The item of mortality whose name is prefixed to the fixture of this chapter. It's prefixed to the head of this chapter, pardon me. So, the item of mortality whose name. So we could... The item of mortality as a noun phrase, remember we spoke about that in another video, the item of mortality whose name. So we know it's got a name. It. Because it's just an item of mortality, so far it's just an it. It's prefixed to the head of this chapter. The head of this chapter, what might that be in modern English? The head, the top? The top of the chapter? Well, there's a name at the top of the chapter, isn't there? Oliver Twist. The item of mortality, the item of life and death, the item of existence, whose name is prefixed to the head of the chapter, is another way of saying Oliver Twist. And if we get to a point where we are able to break down sentence structure and difficult language choices, and the style of different writers, then we'll be fine. It might require a bit of thought sometimes, but don't see something you don't understand the comprehension, then just move on. Make sure you get it. Otherwise, you're really going to struggle come the questions because you won't know where to look. Remember, we spoke about the geography of the text. If someone says, refer to this bit, and all you can remember is not understanding the whole thing, you're not going to know where to look. So it's important to understand what's being written. Good. Okay. For a long time after it was ushered into this world by the parish surgeon. We're probably still talking about the item of mortality. Oliver Twist. Right, remember that. The use of it. Study that. It's important. For a long time after it was ushered into this world, it is a pronoun. Here it's being used to refer to a person. It's important to understand the text, otherwise we're going to get confused. It most commonly refers to an object, not a human being. But here it is being used to refer to a human being. If we don't study the comprehension and try our best to understand it, if we're not reading it attentively, we're never going to get that. It's important to get it. For a long time after it was ushered. Think about theatres, or cinemas, you get an usher, the people who show you to your seats. It's to show or to guide something, to usher. For a long time after Oliver Twist, was guided into this world of sorrow and trouble by the parish surgeon, it remained a matter of considerable doubt whether the child would survive to bear any name at all. Would it even be named? Would it even live? Why? Why might it not live? In which case it is somewhat more than probable that these memoirs would never have appeared, or if they had, that being comprised, made up, so if something's comprised, it's made up of, within a couple of pages, they would have possessed the inestimable. Look for sounds that we recognise. Inestimable. Estimate. Inestimable. Too great to calculate. It's so, we can't even calculate it. We can't make an estimate. Inestimable. The in as a prefix can very often mean not. Right? Estimable, I can make a guess at it. Inestimable, no chance. They would have possessed the memoirs, the biography of Oliver Twist, would have possessed the inestimable merit of being the most concise. If something is concise, it's brief but informative, so short but informative. Being concise is a skill. The ability to write and speak concisely is a skill. To not, use a lot of words to say something that you could have said in about 10. It takes a lot of thought and care and attention. The memoirs would have possessed the inestimable merit of being the most concise and faithful specimen of biography existing in the literature of any age or country. Extant. Although I am not disposed, to be disposed is to be willing. Although I am not willing, I am not disposed to maintain that the being born in a workhouse is in itself the most fortunate and enviable circumstance that can possibly befall a human being. Think about what he's saying there. Is in itself the most fortunate and enviable circumstance, is the luckiest, and we know what envy is, don't we? The most jealousy-inducing circumstance. If someone's born in a workhouse, do you think, oh, how lucky, I wish I could be born in a workhouse? Of course not. That's what Charles Dickens is saying. I'm not willing to say that is what he's saying, because of course it's not. But he does mean to say that in this particular instance, it was the best thing for Oliver Twist that could by possibility have occurred. The fact is that there was considerable difficulty in making something. If you induce something, you make it happen. There was considerable difficulty in inducing Oliver to take upon himself the office of respiration, breathing. If you respire, you breathe. So when he's born, he was struggling to breathe. A troublesome practice, but one which custom had made. If you render something, you make it. Had rendered necessary to our easy existence. Just because breathing is necessary to live, it's become easy for us. We don't think about it. And for some time he lay gasping on a little flock mattress, rather unequally positioned. If you're poised, you're on the tips of your toes, you're positioned, you're ready. Unequally poised between this world and the next, between life and death, because he's struggling to breathe when being born. The balance being decidedly in favour of the latter, the second option. The latter is always the last option. The next, death. It looks like he's more likely to die because he's struggling to breathe after being born. Now, if during this brief period Oliver had been surrounded by careful grandmothers, anxious aunts, experienced nurses, and doctors of profound, if something's profound, it's intense. You can be knowledgeable, really knowledgeable. You can have profound wisdom, for instance. That's what it's saying here. Doctors of profound wisdom, incredibly knowledgeable, intensely knowledgeable. He would have most inevitably, if something's inevitable, it's always going to happen. It's destined to happen. He would have been destined to, and indubitably, it's a way that is evident, a way that's obvious. It's another way of sort of saying, if you say indubitably, it's another way of saying, oh, of course, naturally. So, the doctors of intense wisdom, he would have been, destined to, and naturally, of course he would have been, killed in no time. There being nobody by, however, but a pauper. If someone's a pauper, they're poor. A pauper old woman who was rendered, made, or left. If you render something, you leave it in a certain state. Who was rendered rather misty by an unwanted allowance of beer. Now, what do you think that might mean? Rather misty by an unwanted allowance of beer. What happens when you have an unwanted allowance of beer? You get drunk. And a parish surgeon who did such matters by contract. He gets paid to do things only. Oliver and nature fought out the point between them. So he's got no help. The baby has no help. He has to do it on his own. The result was that, after a few struggles, Oliver breathed, sneezed, and proceeded to advertise to the inmates of the workhouse the fact of a new burden having been imposed upon the parish. He is the burden. A problem. A burden is a problem. By setting up as loud a cry as he reasonably had been expected from a male infant who had not been possessed of that very useful appendage. An appendage is a tool or a body part. And the tool or body part in question here is a voice. For a much longer space of time than 3 minutes and a quarter. He'd only had a voice for that long. And yet he's screaming and shouting. So he's breathing, he's beaten nature, and he did that because he wasn't having any help. He had to fight on his own. And sometimes that's better for us. As Oliver gave this first proof of the free and proper action of his lungs, the patchwork coverlet, the bedding, which was carefully flung over the iron bedstead, rustled. The pale face of a young woman was raised feebly, weakly, from the pillow, and a faint voice imperfectly articulated the words, "Let me see the child, and die." The surgeon had been sitting with his face turned towards the fire, giving the palms of his hands a warm and a rub alternately. As the young woman spoke, he rose, and advancing to the bed's head, said, with more kindness than might have been expected of him, "Oh, you must not talk about dying yet." "Lord bless her dear heart, no." Interposed. To interpose is to, in fact, that's one of your later questions. Have a look at that. Have a think about what that could mean. "Lord bless her dear heart, no." Interposed the nurse. Hastily, quickly. Depositing. To deposit something is to put away. Normally after use. You put something away after use. Hastily depositing in her pocket a green glass bottle, the contents of which she had been tasting in a corner with evident satisfaction. Spoke about the beer earlier, remember? "Lord bless her dear heart, when she has lived as long as I have, sir, and 13 children of her own, and all on 'em dead, except 2. And them in the workus with me. She'll know better than to take on in that way. Bless her dear heart. Think what it is to be a mother. There's a dear young lamb do." Apparently this consolatory perspective of a mother's prospects. Consolatory. What's she trying to do there, this old woman? What's she trying to do to this woman who's dying, she lives as long as I have 13 children of her own, all of them dead except 2, and them in the workhouse with me. She'll know better than to take on in that way. She'll know better. Bless her, she's calling her dear heart. What's she trying to do? She's near death, this woman who's just given birth to Oliver Twist. She's trying to console her. It's a consolatory perspective. That's another question later on. Think about that. Think about that and interpose or highlight them. We will define them later. But they're 2 your questions. Remember, one trick I always use, what I'm trying to say, I'm trying to talk about, interpose, we're talking about speech, and you've got the word hastily, quickly there, or consolatory. She's trying to console her. She keeps calling her dear heart and everything. Use the context, the surrounding information that you know to define words you've never seen before. Apparently this consolatory perspective of a mother's prospects failed in producing its due effect. The patient shook her head and stretched out her hand towards the child. The surgeon deposited it, remember we've already defined deposited, in her arms. She imprinted her cold white lips passionately on its forehead, passed her hands over her face, gazed wildly around, shuddered, fell back, and died. They chafed her breast, hands, and temples. Chafed in a traditional, a modern sense. If you chafe, that's when bits of skin rub together uncomfortably and you get a soreness there, don't you? But in this context, to chafe also means to try and warm, to rub and to try and warm. They chafed her breast, hands, and temples, but the blood had stopped forever. They talked of hope and comfort. They had been strangers too long. "It's all over, Mrs. Thingamy," said the surgeon at last. "Ah, poor dear, so it is," said the nurse, picking up the cork of the green bottle which had fallen out on the pillow, as she stooped, bent over, to take up the child. "Poor dear." Right. Let's have a look at some questions then, shall we? In the opening passage, right at the start, what kind of public building is being mentioned? So we know where to look. I already know the answer because I read attentively. I already know the answer. I remember what kind of buildings being spoken about. It's mentioned multiple times in the text. But look at the start. Among other public buildings, so we're looking for another kind of public building, common to most towns, great or small, to wit, for example, a workhouse. There you go. Answer should be C. Pardon me. D. D. A workhouse. Why was there doubt about whether the child born would be named? Well, we've all just read that story. Can you remember? You know, it spoke about, it would be very short, very short biography, very concise, short but informative, and, child may not even have a name in it. Why? He was struggling to breathe. It was thought that the child would not survive. B. Why did the writer believe that being born in a workhouse was fortunate for Oliver Twist? Now remember what we spoke about. We spoke about he wasn't surrounded by all those people. And whilst Charles Dickens was saying, I'm not going to pretend that a workhouse is the greatest place to be born, but for Oliver Twist it was lucky. Because he wasn't surrounded by all those people trying to look after him. All these people worrying. He had to fight it out himself. He was left to fight nature. It has to be A, that one. Remember, it's important to read carefully. I mean, if we go back here briefly, look how far we have to look to get the answer when we go back. Although I'm not disposed, most fortunate and enviable, well, we know it's not lucky, or it doesn't make us jealous, someone being born in a workhouse. It was the best thing for Oliver Twist. Okay, why? So, there was difficulty in breathing. He says something about everyone being able to breathe. He was poised between life and death. If he'd been surrounded by careful grandmothers, anxious aunts, all these people, he would have been killed in no time. But there was nobody by, however, apart from a poor old woman and a parish surgeon. Oliver and nature fought out the point between them. See how far down we have to go to get that answer in that paragraph. All the way to this second page here. Don't rush to say that that's an answer because you haven't seen it yet. It may be just a bit further on. Don't rush it. For the fourth question, who was present at the birth of Oliver Twist? We just said it. A pauper old woman and a parish surgeon. C. What factors determined that Oliver had won the fight with nature? He was able to breathe. That was a fight. Being able to breathe. So, the result was that after a few struggles, he breathed, sneezed, and proceeded to advertise to the inmates of the workhouse the fact of a new burden having been imposed upon the parish, long sentences, by setting up as loud a cry. So he breathes, he sneezes, he cries, to show that he can breathe. Question 5. He breathed, sneezed, and cried out loud. Has to be C. The answers are there. How did the surgeon react when the young woman spoke about dying? Now remember, she says it here. Let me see the child and die. The surgeon, he rose, advanced to the bed's head, said, with more kindness than might have been expected of him, "Oh, you must not talk about dying yet." That's his reaction. He showed kindness and approached her. Has to be D. All the answers are there. All the answers there. You just need to find them. Use that geography to help you get to that point quickly. I read it properly. I read it with attention. I paid attention to it. That's why my geography of the text is so good. I can find it without having to search and search and search. I don't need to reread it again. I know the sort of place I need to look. How did the nurse react when the young woman spoke about dying? So, did she agree with the young woman that she had to die? Definitely not. I don't remember that. She didn't leave the room. She spoke a bit, remember? She scolded the young woman, didn't tell her off, no. Process of elimination, she comforted the young woman. Process of elimination is always a valid option. Don't feel ashamed by using it. You don't need to go up and hunt down the answer. If you know that if you are certain 3 of those answers are wrong, that's a completely valid way of getting to the correct answer. Why did the nurse mention her own experiences? Well, look at the answer you've just given. She comforted the young woman. To boast about her own motherhood, no. To criticise the young woman, no. To show off her knowledge about parenting, no. This one says comfort as well. It's all about trying to comfort the young woman. Has to be C again. What was the young woman's response immediately? Now, don't get muddled here. Immediately after holding the child. We know Oliver Twist's mother, the young woman, dies. We know she dies. But does she do it immediately? The surgeon deposited the baby, in her arms. She imprinted her cold white lips passionately on its forehead. That's the first thing Dickens mentions. That is the immediate reaction. She kissed the child. D. It's the first thing she does. Don't get confused. Don't get muddled. What was the fate of the ox? Now this is a different question. What was the fate? How did it end? You got your immediate response and the fate. The end, we know how it ends. C, she died. Right, let's have a look at this. This is why I told you to think about the definition of those words. Answer the following questions about the meanings of the words that are used in the passage. Which of these is closer in the meaning to consolatory? So it's used here, remember? This consolatory perspective of a mother's prospects. Right? Bless her dear heart. Okay? She's going on about, bless her dear heart, bless her dear. She's trying to comfort her. Consolatory has to be comforting. It's trying to comfort her. Has to be comforting. What does the word interposed mean? Now remember, that was when the nurse came in to speak. Interposes herself on the conversation. She does agree, and she does reply. She does all of those things, but what's the closest one? She interrupts. Let's talk about haste and being quick. She jumped in. She interrupted him. Has to be C. 2 more. These you don't need a knowledge of your comprehension. These are just questions about understanding grammar now. Which the following about which word in the sentence Oliver had been surrounded by careful grandmothers is an adjective? Well, what word describes a noun? What are the nouns here? Oliver and grandmothers. There's nothing about Oliver. Grandmothers, they're careful. Has to be C. What type of words are these? Bottle, mattress, pillow, coverlet. Well, they're things, they're nouns. What kind of nouns? Well, they're not capitalised. They're not people, they're not countries. Has to be a common noun. A common noun. That one's B. I hope that going through these comprehensions together is helping you pick up on tips and tricks, and most importantly, it's really illustrating the importance of being an attentive reader. Thank you.